All right. Okay. Welcome everybody. Happy May Day. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to our co-sponsors for this event, the Dorothy Day Labor Forum, the Spokane Industrial Workers of the World, and the Spokane Democratic Socialists of America. My name is Will Neville. I currently serve as the secretary of the Spokane DSA here. And yeah, so kind of, what we're doing, we're here today just to also celebrate May Day and work to popularize Spokane's radical labor history here. Just put together a group of, union activists, community organizers, students, professors, and all in between to try to work to popularize Spokane's labor history. And especially with the recent success of Jess Walter's Cold Millions, it's what a lot of us are working to do. So just kind of get started with a brief introduction of everything. The recent success of Jess Walter's Cold Millions have brought to light some of Spokane's labor history that exists going back to the time that labor went to war with capital in 1909 and 1910. Many Spokane community members, to include union activists, students, professors, etc., have come together to try to popularize Spokane's radical labor history and help shift the class consciousness by getting a plaque, monument, marker as a means of formal recognition to remember the free speech fights of 1909 and 1910. Cities such as Fresno, California, and Missoula, Montana, have taken formal steps to recognize the free speech fights of 1909 and 1910, as they have, plaques, markers installed in their towns indicating the historical significance. Spokane was considered an epicenter of the free speech fights of 1909 and 1910, and it's time, get Spokane to formally recognize the free speech fights of 1909 and 1910. I'm going to do a share screen here real quick. So the Peace and Justice League of Spokane here have agreed to be a financial sponsor for this here. Let me know if everybody can see it. This is the Free Speech Fight Monument project here. So today we're also kicking off our project here as a community. And we're still kind of determining what we'll have. We already have the backing of the city council president, Brian Beggs. And they'll put the website here in the chat, and it'll probably be spread around through various community groups as the days progress. And so yeah, I will put this in the chat here so folks can spread around. Let's see. All right. And so we're here today with the panelists. So we have Bob Lambeth with Spokane Historical, who will be presenting on the free speech fights of 1909 and 1910. We have Tina Morrison, Secretary Treasurer of the Spokane Regional Labor Council, and we have Dale Soden, who is a professor of history at Whitworth University, and who will be providing some labor songs that are interspersed. And I also have a surprise for you all. It's Ken Cruz will probably be joining us. There's some technical difficulties here and there. And he wants to talk about the state of the U.S. Postal Service. Ken is with the American Postal Workers Union Local 338 here in Spokane. And yeah, I just want to start off and give some folks this video here from Jess Walter. And yeah, here we go. One moment here.
Hi there, it's Jess Walter. I'm sorry I can't be there for this informational meeting, but I'm in Seattle moving my daughter, and duty calls. First, I want to thank you all for your interest in commemorating the free speech movement in 1909 and the long, rich history of labor and social justice in Spokane. In 2020, I published a novel called The Cold Millions, in which I wanted to write about the industrial workers of the world, Elizabeth Gurley, Flynn, some of the heroes of this moment. And I wanted to tell a rip-roaring story. I wanted to write the sort of Western that my dad loved. But I also wanted to honor what felt to me like a forgotten chapter that I felt like people didn't know enough about. History tends to tilt, of course, towards the business and political leaders in a community. But the Northwest was built on the backs of hundreds of thousands, millions of workers, like my grandfathers, like my father, people who will never have streets named for them or schools, but whose blood and sweat built those streets and those schools. I hope to tell the story of labor leaders and activists who fought for those workers, who went to jail for them. But the story I told is fiction, embellished and mined for its entertainment possibility. I hope, like me, you'll support this wonderful effort to celebrate the true, rich story behind the Cold Millions and a vein of Spokane's history that I think has been ignored for too long, of the entire Northwest's history. So I want to thank you for your interest and for your activism. We're living through history too, of course, right now. And sometimes I think it helps to look forward by looking back, by honoring the selfless and courageous people who came before us and who made a real difference in this community. Now, speaking of labor, I better get back to loading this U-Haul or my daughter will disown me. But thanks again. Go Spokane, and we'll see you soon.
All right. That was a wonderful video by Jess Walter there. Yeah. Yeah, right on. Yeah. So so we have Dale Soden here with us, who's going to lead us in a song here. He has a kind of a plethora of songs he's going to play for us today, and allow him the privilege to choose any song, any labor song that he would like for us. Dale, take us away.
Thanks, Will. Good to be with you. Thanks for inviting me. As Will said, I'm a professor of history at Whitworth, and one of the subjects I love to teach is Pacific Northwest history. I've had Jess into my class several times, and so as he says, the labor history of the Northwest and the inland Northwest is a great story. So one of the things I like to do is to get my students to sing. I say that I'm not really a performer, I'm a song leader. So I'm imagining that you're going to be singing with me. Now I know in Zoom, that's probably not going to happen, but at least in my head, I'm going to have you sing along with me. So we've got 4 songs that are interspersed between the presentations. And I'm going to start with maybe one of the more well-known ones from the era, The Preacher and the Slave, written by Joe Hill. Gets us a little bit in the mood for Bob's presentation on the Spokane free speech fight. I'll say more about Joe Hill himself in the second song, which is about Joe Hill. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill. But Joe Hill wrote this 1911, 2 years after the Spokane free speech fight, and it does hint at some of the dynamic. Whether Bob will touch on this or not, obviously be up to him, but between the Salvation Army and those who were fighting for free speech. And in some sense, the dynamic of the Salvationists trying to somehow sing out loud and overwhelm those who got up on the free speech boxes and were advocating for better working conditions in the mines and in the forests. So we'll do that to begin with. So remember, we're going to talk. One lyric is the Starvation Army as opposed to the Salvation Army. Long-haired preachers come out every night, try to tell you what's wrong and what's right. But when asked how about something to eat, they will answer in voices so sweet. You will eat By and by, in that glorious land above the sky, work and pray, live on hay. You'll get high in the sky when you die. That's a lie. My students always like that last line. Oh, the Starvation Army, they play, and they sing and they clap and they pray till they get all your coin on the drum. Then they'll tell you when you're on the bum, you will eat by and by in that glorious land above the sky. Work and pray, live on hay. You'll get high in the sky when you die. That's a lie. If you fight hard for children and wife, try to get something good in this life. You're a sinner and bad man, they tell. When you die, you will sure go to hell. You will eat by and by in that glorious land above the sky. Work and pray, live on hay. You get high in the sky when you die. That's a lie. Holy rollers and jumpers come out, and they holler, they jump and they shout. Give your money to Jesus, they say. He will cure all diseases today. You will eat by and by in that glorious land above the sky. Work and pray, live on hay. You'll get high in the sky when you die. That's a lie. Working men of all countries tonight, side by side we'll for freedom we fight. When the world and its wealth we have gained, to the grafter we'll sing this refrain. You will eat by and by when you learn how to cook and to fry. Chop some wood, do you good, and you'll eat in the sweet by and by. That's no lie.
Bravo. Thanks, Dale.
You're welcome.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll hear some more labor songs here, and yeah, like at the end of everything, we'll take some questions. Yeah. Oh, hi, Ken. Yeah. So, yeah. So next, have our first. I have a presenter here, Bob Lambeth. I think you have the ability to share screen. Yeah. Feel free to take us away, Bob, on the presentation of the free speech fights of 1909 and 1910.
Okay, thanks, Will. Is it up there? Can you see it okay?
See it just fine.
All right, let me get this out of the way and start this thing. All the Zoom control panel stuff's in my way, and now I can't. Okay, there we go. So while I'm doing this, just want to once again thank you for inviting me onto this panel to talk about the free speech fights. As has been mentioned before, Jess Walter mentioned this too. It's a forgotten chapter in Spokane's history, and I think labor history in general is just a forgotten and really important, but unfortunately forgotten chapter in American history in general. So hopefully, with the time allowed, I can fit this all in here and give you all a better idea of the significance of this free speech fights, not just tell you the most interesting aspects of it. I titled this "The IWW's Free Speech Fight in Spokane: How a Misunderstood Radical Labor Union Helped Reshape Modern Understandings of the First Amendment." us historians really like to use long, convoluted subtitles, so excuse that. So a brief historical background really quick for those of you here that aren't really aware of the IWW's history. It was formed in 1905, and a lot of the stuff that I really don't have time to talk about, but ultimately I think that the IWW's formation was a sign of a mass rejection of traditional craft labor unionism as provided by and organized by the AFL. Because craft labor liked to focus on what they called skilled workers, and the unskilled workers, in quotes there, were the timber harvesters, the farm hands, the miners, the mostly migratory workers that the IWW focused their organizing drives on, and that were completely ignored by the AFL for a long time. The formation of the IWW represents the growth of industrial capitalism at the early 20th century, and also the increasing dehumanization of and radicalism expressed by industrial workers. They're anarcho-syndicalists, not socialist, not Marxist, whatever they've been accused of. It's anarcho-syndicalism. But it's a distinctly American type of anarchism. It's not rooted in traditional European anarchism, and it never proposed violence as a tool. That it focused on raising class consciousness to a level to where a general strike could be commenced, and then at that point the mode of production could be assumed by the workers. The IWW really always has and still does focus on this notion of direct action. Not expecting political or legal, forces to help the workers, that the workers needed to affect those changes themselves. And passive resistance, as we'll see as we get further into this presentation, was an important part of that. We often think of, Dr. Martin Luther King and his inspirations from Gandhi. But in my opinion, I think that the free speech fights were probably one of the, at least in modern times, are more influential in the use of passive resistance. And also vagrancy laws, disorderly conduct, and these kind of things were used. These were local laws passed in response to the IWW's organizing drives and their success in those drives to, and quote unquote, stem the tide. They used that a lot. It was something that the bosses and local governments really feared. So 1908 to 1909 in Spokane. So you had employment agencies, which the Wobblies like to call job sharks. They would squeeze fees from the workers in exchange for jobs. Oftentimes these could be a scam. Sometimes the job didn't exist. Oftentimes the bosses split the fees with the agencies that they got from the workers. So even if the job did work out and was legit, they were still paying to work. They were paying for the privilege to work for really low wages. Now the IWW had been organizing since 1905, not so successfully yet in Spokane, but that's when James Walsh of the Overalls Brigade, he was considered the general, if you will, came in and really reshaped the IWW in Spokane. He got a better headquarters, a better building. He got a library. He increased connections with local lawyers. I mean, he really did everything he could to try and make the IWW as strong as it could be. He saw the potential that Spokane had. It's a hub from the timber harvesting in the east and the north, the ranching and farming in the west and south, and of course the mining in the Coeur d'Alene district. So Spokane was a railway hub for all of these industries. And so James Walsh made huge gains in organizing. And this really scared the powers that be, right? The status quo at the time. And so working through the Chamber of Commerce and other employers associations, they appealed to the city government for assistance to stem this tide of IWW organizing. So in response, the city of Spokane passed a law in early March of 1909, which prohibited stump speeches or street corner speeches of any kind. But it was pretty clear that right away it was meant to just antagonize the IWW. And there we go. So this initiates a mass arrests, which then subsequently initiates a mass movement. So on March 4th, 1909, just after the law was passed, Walsh stood atop a soapbox to address, and this is about all he got to say before he was arrested, to address his fellow workers and friends. He was immediately arrested by the Spokane police and jailed. He was convicted and sentenced. His lawyers were appealing, and during that time was when the Wobblies hit the streets of downtown Spokane to challenge that law and then sign a solidarity with Walsh. And they knew they were going to be harassed, and they knew they were going to be arrested, and that's why they did it. So within a week, the jail was full. The jail used to be under the courthouse, obviously much smaller than the jail they have now, but I mean, even for then, they weren't prepared for this movement. And, you know, men, women, of course, were members of the IWW as well as children. You know, they packed, and early on, it was packed 10 to 15 deep in cells made for 4 people. Early 1910, that would change, and there'd be 30 people stuffed in these cells. Workers were coming from all over the region just to be arrested. Right? I wrote here class consciousness at its best. I mean, the solidarity involved in this is, I think, almost impossible for us in 2021 to understand. Even the most ardent of you know, union organizers, I think that this is something that we could only imagine in our dreams, right? Donations were being received from all around the nation, and this quickly became not just a solidarity and union repression issue, but a constitutional one. And the IWW really grabbed at the chance to use the First Amendment as an opportunity not to just you know, get their message across and increase membership, but to really like highlight the kind of oppression that these quote unquote unskilled workers, these migratory workers, have been facing. And passive resistance was the key to the movement. Violent self-defense was not permitted. Again, we think of the civil rights movement. This is always, I think, for most Americans, one of the first things that comes to mind. You know, obviously, this was 40 some years from the civil rights movement that we're aware of. But this was a different kind of civil rights movement, and one that passive resistance is not often considered when we think of union radicals. And like I just mentioned, the First Amendment was a tool for the IWW to expose the American justice and political system for what they felt it really was. And this focus really, you know, 1909, 1908 to 1910, they were really focusing on building up this movement to the point to where the organizing drive suffered. And they focused so much on this free speech fighting, 1909 to 1910 mostly. So their organizing drive suffered as a result of this. And many of the communities that relied upon migrant workers, think of the Palouse, you know, these little timber towns and mining towns in the mountains, in the Rockies. They relied on these guys. They relied on these men and women, these migrant workers, to do all the work that nobody else wanted to do for the wages they were being offered. But they also wanted them to just be there, do the work, shut up, stay hidden, and just not cause any trouble. And it was that kind of attitude that really kind of helped shape the IWW in representing these kind of workers. It really helped shape the organization into one more of a, at this point, kind of a civil rights organization that was fighting for migrant workers who had been kind of forgotten and were invisible for most people. So in essence, the free speech fights really early on became an existential struggle for those workers, not just dues paying members. It was you know, something that they were trying to fight for all of these workers. When confronted by police officers for asking for speaking permits, which of course the Salvation Army would have been allowed to or probably didn't have to apply for because they would be targeted, or the Volunteers of America, for example. But when the IWW went out and spoke, the cops would ask them for speaking permits. And there was this one interesting incident where, and this is probably a common response, is we have none save the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. I found that really powerful argument in response to such a really asinine request. And the IWW is not a very popular union amongst other unions, amongst the general public. You know, it was mostly, you know, because of media campaigns in the mainstream media against the IWW. The IWW was protecting their First Amendment rights, or the protection of the First Amendment rights during the free speech fights, I think made their unpopularity, made protecting First Amendment rights all the more vital, all the more significant, that this wasn't some popular group being violated. Here's a popular message that you would have seen in labor newspapers during this time. One, remember the boys in jail. Another one here, I have in quotes, we're in here for you, you're out there for us. This was the word, getting the word out to wobblies across the region, throughout the West and the country in general, or any prospective supporters. And even the state labor federations and the AFL at first kind of were quiet, but really quickly started to be more vocal about what was happening. And this was their organizational and ideological enemy. But that didn't matter. What was happening to them was criminal, not what they were doing. And the city, even with traditional conservative labor now supporting what was going on and decrying the city's response, the city doubled down on their martial tactics. And late 1909, early 1910 saw an increase in police brutality and a marked increase in terrible jail conditions. There's the press, the Spokane Press, a local labor-friendly newspaper. There's a front page, 2 men died while in custody in the Spokane jail because of the conditions were so brutal. F. Ferry, and I've tried, I still haven't got the guy's first name, but F. Ferry, he died in April 1910, and S.O. Chin, I believe Samuel, but don't quote me on that, another name, they like to use the initials in these newspapers. But both these men died in April 1910 as a result of their treatment in the jail. They were fed, everybody, as the jails got fuller and fuller, the Wobblies were fed a daily diet of 2 ounces of bread and some water. Many succumbed to renal failure, people's kidneys shut down, people got diabetes, which was the cause of death for Chin or Ferry. One of them contracted diabetes, according to the coroner's report. But as terrible as it must have been and terrible as it was, I mean, the solidarity maintained is just really, really inspiring for me. I mean, they sang their revolutionary songs. They refused to work the rock pile, a literal giant pile of rocks that you had to break with hammers, something you would see like in a Looney Tune cartoon, but it was a real punishment. They held their meetings, they held stated meetings, and they maintained their revolutionary zeal throughout. And I underline this because I really believe it, right? That solidarity saved lives. Considering the inhumane conditions that only 2 men died, it's actually kind of surprising. Of the 400 Wobblies that ended up becoming incarcerated during this event, 334 had to seek medical treatment for a total of 1,600 times afterwards, combined, as a result of that treatment. Routine tortures, sensory deprivations, extreme heat and cold exposures, beatings, invasive strip searches, So, just like, you can imagine any terrible conditions in any jail. But the jails filled so fast because the call to the fellow workers to come support the imprisoned wobblies was so successful that the jails filled so fast they had to convert the old Franklin school into a makeshift jails where the conditions were even more intolerable. That school is no longer around. I wish I had some old pictures of it. That got torn down right after this. Okay, so this thing's in the way. And now that's in the way, sorry. Okay, so 1910, continued resistance, increased brutality, but promising change on the horizon. The attacks continue or morphed into raids that were conducted on their headquarters. One was on Stevens Street, a big one. They stole money. Documents were destroyed. The Spokane police, and I still haven't quite figured out the details on this and how they were able to do it, or if they were doing it in cooperation with the Coeur d'Alene police, but they even raided the IWW offices in Coeur d'Alene. And the solidarity, the continued resistance, and then the city and police response just got worse and worse. And that frustration from local officials kind of trickled down to the police ranks, who became more violent. The beatings became more common, but on the streets, not just in the jails. The women that were involved with this movement were sexually harassed, and children, of course, as I mentioned earlier, were, some were dues-paying members, and kids were often workers in these industrial, in several industries. So kids were not spared the violence. And the workers maintained their composure in the face of the repressive violence, but the community they had built within and without the walls of the jails became a source of comfort and undoubtedly helped save lives. So by 1910, the response generated by the free speech fight just in Spokane had been popular enough that organizers and executives started new fronts in Missoula, Fresno, San Diego, Sacramento, Seattle, Portland, I think Eugene, and there were several others. Really mostly in the U.S. West, if not entirely confined to the U.S. West, places where migrant workers were easily found. So I can kind of consider this as the free speech fights in Spokane as being a front in a larger war for worker autonomy. And I want to take this time really quick towards the end of this presentation to kind of measure, how do we kind of ask, I guess, how do we measure the successes of the Spokane free speech fights? First off, the city of Spokane was not financially and morally prepared for the continued resistance of the Wobblies and their supporters, but the workers were. And many of them have spoke to this fact. They could have continued longer if necessary. It was important, and they knew they were making progress. And the increased repression demonstrated that. So what can be accomplished with passive resistance and direct action? So in this particular instance, job sharking was all but abolished in Spokane. Eventually, the entire state outlawed employment agencies that asked for a payment from the worker beforehand. I think we have a different but similar situation with temporary services right now. But maybe that's something we can discuss later. But meetings, IWW meetings, in or outside, would no longer be repressed. They would be able to continue those, and their publications could once again run without any interference from the city or police. The long-term changes affected by the free speech fights. This is where the significance, I think, really kicks in. So the free speech fights were really inaugurated in Spokane and tested in Spokane. And it set the stage for similar actions throughout the West, as I just mentioned. This forced local and state governments to begin to recognize, or at least be more cognizant of, the rights of migratory workers and labor unions in general. World War I, brought a lot more changes for free speech and for union recognition. So this period was really just the kind of opening the door for all of that. And it was the IWW that did that opened that door. It laid the foundation for free speech lawyer Roger Baldwin and IWW member / labor activist Elizabeth Gurley Flynn to a group of free speech advocates who established the ACLU in 1920. And Flynn attributed her experience during the free speech fight, of which she was an integral part of, as the motivation for the ACLU's creation in 1920, which would, of course, is, I'm sure everybody here is aware of, is one of the preeminent defenders of free speech in the United States. And so the shift in how the average American understood free speech, I think, and other scholars have attested to this similarly, can be attributed to the IWW's efforts, the free speech fights that really lasted from 1909 to 1913. And before Schenck v. US in 1919, one of the big landmark free speech cases in the United States, the Wobblies were effecting on-the-ground change at the local level. A decade before World War I brought the Schenck case to the Supreme Court. And even those who detested the Wobblies could hardly agree with the methods of oppression used against them. That really this starts to reshape how Americans understood that even the most unpopular opinions have the right to be protected by the First Amendment. So change is slow and purposeful. I titled this slide this way, one because of the quote from the New Republic, which states that agitation by radicals often prompts the careful improvements of more reasonable reformers and the constructive plans of statesmen. Now, I'm really, I can't argue with it because I think it speaks true in a lot of ways. I don't necessarily agree with the language used, but I think it's fair to say that the most profound socioeconomic and legal changes that have ever occurred in this nation, that work is done in the trenches. It's on the streets, like long before the issue can make it to the courts. So public opinion is drastically altered when average citizens organize and fight like hell. It does not happen by just waiting for it. It has to be made to happen. That legal politicians, policymakers, the courts, they're not going to do these things, no matter how bad the conditions get, until the people that are affected the most by it are willing to stand up and fight for it. And I think that's there we go. And I think that's like any civil rights movement that we've experienced in this country, or any civil rights struggle, for any group of marginalized Americans, that free speech fights here in Spokane, or anywhere else for that matter, really represent the significance, the importance, the need for those people, for workers, for unemployed workers, for the people that are boots on the ground being affected by these, whatever it is that is affecting them. That they need to work. I mean, I think we have to consider in the 21st century notions of organizing. I don't know how or what, but it's something needs to change, because just the way the economy is running now, and service industry, and no manufacturing. But regardless, it's us, it's those people, whoever it may be, that need to kind of really rise up and organize against the stuff. And I think that's the biggest significance of the free speech fights, right? Is what the kind of change it was able to affect in the long run. Maybe not right then in 1909 or 1910. I mean, it affected some big changes on the local level, and then eventually the state, and then eventually the nation, right? I mean, these things all set into motion a series of events that led to Schenck v. US, and that led to remodifying contemporary understandings of what the First Amendment means. So also a radical labor union like using the First Amendment and using legal constitutional jargon to their benefit, I think is extremely interesting. But I think it's important to, if you're willing to fight within the bounds of the parameters of the law in any way, that's what you have to do. So anyway, I probably left some stuff out, but if you have time for questions or whatever, I'd be more than happy to answer them. But yeah.
Thank you, Bob. That was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so yeah, at the end of the presentation, we'll do a summary of discussion kind of the presenters, and then that's when we'll go into the question and answer session. That's okay. Cool. And we'll get to yours, George. So yeah, thank you so much for that once again, Bob. Thank you. And yeah, so we'll Dale, if you want to kind of take us away with another song, I'll let you have it here.
Yeah, well, the second one I'd like to do is about Joe Hill. It's again probably a song that most of you have heard before. It's quite famous. Just a little bit about Joe Hill. I mentioned that he wrote the song "The Preacher and the Slave." But Joe was born in Sweden, 1879, emigrated to this country. He joined the IWW, Bob's been talking about, in Portland in 1910, so just about the time that we're talking here. Wrote, again, a number of songs, "Preacher and the Slave," also "Rebel Girl," about Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. In 1914, early 1914, he was working near Salt Lake City, and there was a murder of an ex-policeman and his son. And as you might imagine, there was a dragnet of sorts, and lots of people actually were arrested for this murder. And along with Joe Hill. Joe Hill actually had been wounded. He always claimed that he had never anything to do with the killing of this cop, but nevertheless he was charged, tried, convicted. People from all over the country went to bat for Joe Hill, but unsuccessfully, and he was executed by a firing squad in 1915. So he emerged as almost a mythical figure within the labor movement itself. So there was a song, actually a poem, first written in 1930 by a man named Alfred Hayes. And then 6 years later, it was put to music by Earl Robinson and made probably most famous by the great African-American singer Paul Robeson and Pete Seeger, Joan Baez. Lots of people have recorded this song. So it's always intimidating to sing something that Paul Robeson made famous. But I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead, but I never died, says he. I never died, says he. In Salt Lake, Joe, I said to him, standing by my bed, they framed you on a murder charge, says Joe, but I ain't dead, says Joe, but I ain't dead. The copper bosses shot you, Joe, they killed you, Joe, says I. Takes more than guns to kill a man, says Joe, I didn't die, says Joe, I didn't die. And standing there as big as life and smiling with his eyes, Joe says, what could they never kill? Went on to organize, went on to organize. Joe Hill ain't dead, he says to me, Joe ain't never died. When workers strike and organize. Joe Hill is by their side. Joe Hill is by their side. From San Diego up to Maine, in every mine and mill, where workers stand up for their rights, it's there you'll find Joe Hill. It's there you'll find Joe Hill.
Thank you, Dale.
You're welcome.
In the words of Joe Hill, don't mourn, organize. Yep. That was great. Yeah, thank you once again. And so just want to make a quick plug here real quick. Just going to put it in the chat. Since today we're also kicking off the Spokane Free Speech Fight Monument Project. I just want to put that in the chat here real quick. All right, well, thank you. And next presenter is Tina Morrison, Secretary Treasurer with the Spokane Regional Labor Council. Tina, take us away.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be here today and speak with you. It's been really interesting so far. As a qualifier, I am not a professor, I am a musician. And as far as being a musician, I am a woodwind specialist primarily and cannot sing a note. So really appreciate the work that Dale is doing today. It's beautiful. I'm going to open up with, we have for the national president is Richard Trumka, is president of the AFL-CIO. He comes out of the United Mine Workers, and he came out with a statement for May Day. He says, every year on May Day, working people in our unions across the country and around the world take action to show that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. All working people are entitled to living wages, basic rights, and dignity on the job, regardless of where we were born, what language we speak, and what faith we practice. This International Workers' Day, we are rising up and calling on senators to immediately pass the PRO Act and immigration reforms that will ensure all workers can join together to demand rights at work. To fix the systems that have failed working families, we must be united across borders. Together, we can rewrite the rules of the global economy and ensure that workers are no longer treated like disposable commodities. America's unions are fiercely committed to transforming the lives of working people through bold structural changes that remove all barriers to the right to organize. In order to build worker power to lift standards in our workplaces, we must finally enact meaningful immigration and labor law reforms. This includes the protection of and expansion of civil rights. The right to vote and the right to have that vote accurately counted is a fundamental building block of democracy and one of the most important ways for working people to express our voices. Just as it is important to fight for fairness in the workplace, it's also important that working people can vote for candidates who will work on our behalf. Protecting every working person's right to vote is a critical part of any labor reform effort. As we mobilize this May Day, America's labor movement and our allies are engaged in a full-scale national campaign to win a long overdue path to citizenship and pass the PRO Act, which would give the tens of millions of workers who want to form a union a path to do so. There is much more we need to do to ensure all people are able to live and work safely and with dignity, which is why we are fighting for our right to join together and demand changes to the rules of our rigged system. We will continue to mobilize to demand reforms that uplift the standards and rights of all workers with no exclusions. I think that's a really good statement for what we've been working on here in Spokane. Just briefly, the Spokane Regional Labor Council is the union of unions for the region. We represent workers from the private sector, such as Ken, or the public sector, such as Ken and the postal workers, and private sector like Kaiser Aluminum, to my own union, which is the Professional Musicians of the Inland Northwest, Local 105. And just as a point of history, Local 105 of the musicians was chartered in 1900 here in Spokane. We have a variety of committees where we try to educate ourselves and educate others, and are constantly working on things that are important to the labor movement in our area. One of the things that we've missed the last couple of years is the Workers' Memorial. April 28th is International Workers' Memorial Day, and I think our focus has been more around Workers' Memorial than trying to do Workers' Memorial and May Day, which is two events very close together. Our Workers' Memorial is located in Mission Park, and you can go there and see the names of workers from Spokane that have died due to work-related illness or injury. This year, like last year, we were unable to meet in person due to the COVID restrictions. We're hoping maybe to put something together in the summer, but I can tell you that 119 workers, not just union workers, but workers in Washington State lost their lives last year, 23 from COVID-related illnesses. The Spokane Regional Labor Council and our labor unions have been very active trying to find protections for our workers since the pandemic started last February, a year ago, and have been working at all levels to educate our members on how to be safe, educate employers on how to be safe, and push for regulations through the governor to make sure that our workers are protected. And so it just added to, the plate of things that we do. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story. I told you I'm a musician, and musicians tend to run in families. My father was a bass player, and as a 17-year-old bass player in 1940, he was able to earn money. This is during the Depression. His family had lost money in the stock market, and he was playing what was termed the evil jazz music that embarrassed his family very greatly. His parents were very dead set against that, his going out and doing this, but it actually did put food on the table. And my father continued to perform up until he was 84 years old. But we saw the shift. I became a musician. I joined my union in 1989. I became a primary officer in 1998, sorry. And then my son is also a bass player, and he started playing out in commercial venues when he was 17 years old in 2006. This was a time when, the economy was still fairly solid. In my time, in my years as a primary officer at the Musicians Local, I saw a change happen, and I couldn't understand why. We went from musicians working 4 or 5 nights a week, being able to get pension for their work, being able to get paid properly for their work. I saw this erosion happen, and it made me curious. Why is this happening? And basically what I found out is that the labor laws had changed in 1959. The musicians union fought the change that impacted musicians up until 1978. And after 1978, which basically seemed like a very small thing, it said that clubs were no longer the employers. The band leader was the employer, or the contractor was the employer. So we were no longer able to do contracts with clubs, and it completely undermined the ability of musicians to get paid. For a number of years, it took a long time, but for a number of years, club owners assumed that musicians needed to be paid for their work. And then all of a sudden, their responsibility went away, and new club owners realized that they didn't have to pay musicians, which has resulted in this steady erosion of the ability of musicians to earn a living. It's very stark in the musicians union, and that's why I use it as an example. In the 1940s, we were the largest, most powerful union in the country. And today, most freelance musicians struggle. And you hear the struggle all the time with playing out in public, and our wages have been frozen, and it's due to labor law changes. So that's one of the reasons that the PRO Act is so important to us as labor activists. Along with the basic 1959 law that changed and has eroded things, there has been a long process of employers, teaching cream rises to the top. You don't want labor to prevent you from being able to, work your way up in a company. And, all of this misinformation that was really directed at workers through the 70s, and in particular, the 80s and Ronald Reagan's presidency, the busting of the federal air traffic controller strike, all of these things were key components in putting us where we are today. So Patty Murray, Senator Patty Murray from Washington State, was a co-author of the PRO Act. And some of the reasons, I'll give you a few examples of why it's really important to us as workers. Starting with, let me grab my papers here. A problem. Employers can fire pro-union workers with no real consequences. If we can get the PRO Act passed, the PRO Act establishes civil penalties for employers who violate workers' rights, as well as individual liability for corporate officials. The PRO Act authorizes the award of monetary damages to workers who are illegally fired or suffer other serious economic harm. The legislation directs the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, to seek federal court injunctions to get illegally fired workers back in their jobs while their retaliation cases are pending. And it creates a private right of action so that illegally discharged workers can file civil lawsuits against their employers and are not wholly dependent on the National Labor Relations Board to pursue their cases. So just a little comment on the National Labor Relations Board. I can tell you, once again, mostly from my musicians' experience, but also going over to the rest of our union's experience with this past National Labor Relations Board. The president appoints the National Labor Relations Board. And the last board was so bad that unions were doing everything in their power to resolve grievances, issues with employers, without having to take it to National Labor Relations Board, because we knew that if it went before that board, they would rule against us and set precedents that would make it so much more difficult for us to take care of our workers going forward. So another problem, employers interfere with the election process. Why has it been so difficult for unions, for workers to form unions? And the one of the issues is that employers stall the election to buy time to campaign against the union. They can actually require that employees attend meetings that talk about why they shouldn't be forming a union. They are inundated with propaganda against unions. And the PRO Act addresses employer delay tactics by restoring the Obama era changes to the representation election process, and makes clear that the decision over the proper bargaining unit is to be made by workers and the NLRB, not manipulated by employers. So that would be another key piece. Another issue is employers hire union busters to push back on workers' power. So the PRO Act requires prompt disclosure of union busting activities and closes the loophole through which employers and consultants have evaded reporting. Another aside, for unions, we have to report just about everything. When you think about the IRS, we report not only to the IRS, we also report to the Office of Labor Management Standards. So our finances are open to the public. Everybody can see what we do. Our elections are strictly regulated for every local and every central labor council, to the state labor council, to the AFL-CIO. We've got all kinds of reporting and I's to dot and T's to cross, which just makes things, more difficult. So those are a few examples. When we talk about, why people haven't organized, it's because the game has been stacked against us for a long time. And, you think, like for myself as a labor leader for the musicians in particular, why can I not fight back? Why is it that we can't just, go out and strike against a club? Oh, well, we can't. It's illegal. And if we were to do so, we'd be sued into the ground and lose any possibility of representing the people that we already have. So, all of these stacked laws over the years have undermined our ability as workers to come together, to form a union, to create a union workforce. I hear from people all the time, I want a good union job. And, we try to say, well, whatever job you're doing, you can organize and form your own union and be able to take bites with each contract level and be able to build it, as so many of our historic contracts have done, to get people taken care of, get them paid properly, to get their health insurance and have a pension so that they can retire with dignity. But honestly, it's been so difficult. We just saw this in Bessemer, Alabama with the Amazon workers. It is so difficult to form a union that people get discouraged and it doesn't happen, and workers continue to be abused. So we really, we're not putting all our eggs in one basket with the PRO Act. We know it's going to be a struggle to get it passed, but I'll just say that this is the most important labor legislation that we've seen in this country since the 1950s. And from the one-parent households that supported their families in the 1950s to two working parents working, 6 jobs between the two of them in order to just put a roof over their heads. Today, this legislation would give us the ability to fight back. But we're covering lots of different bases. So I will absolutely entertain any questions when we get to that point, but I appreciate the time today, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Tina. And just like I saw in the chat here, just thank you so much for all of your hard work and representing the workers here in the greater Inland Northwest. And yeah, it's important to pass the PRO Act. It's the strongest piece of pro-labor legislation that we've seen in a very long time. Yeah, and then we'll get to questions later on. Now, Dale, have any songs for us?
Sure. Thank you, Tina, for that. That was really informative. We appreciate it. This song is a little lesser known, but it is associated with the Everett Massacre in 1916, and it's called Hold the Fort. Like a lot of these songs, there are lyrics set to an old hymn that a lot of these workers would have known. So the setting is in November 1916. The Wobblies had been trying to organize mill workers in shingle mill workers in Everett, and had been subjected to a lot of harassment and even brutality. So a group commissioned a boat, Verona, to come up from Seattle to Everett. And they were trying to disembark. And apparently on the way up, they were singing this song to give them courage. So you have to kind of imagine, because they didn't know exactly what was going to happen. And when they got there, a lot of people, about 200 people, had been deputized, and they didn't want them to disembark. Shots rang out, and in the end, five Wobblies were killed, 27 were wounded. Ended up in a trial, but this is Hold the Fort. We meet today in freedom's cause. We raise our voices high. We'll join our hands in union strong to battle or to die. Hold the fort, for we are coming. Union men, be strong. Side by side we battle onward. Victory is nigh. Look, my comrades, see the Union banners waving high. Reinforcements now appearing, victory is nigh. Hold the fort, for we are coming. Union men, be strong. Side by side we battle onward, victory is nigh. See our numbers still increasing, hear the bugle blow. By our union we shall triumph over every foe. Hold the fort, for we are coming. Union men, be strong. Side by side we battle onward, victory is nigh. Fierce and long the battle rages, but we will not fear. Help will come whene'er it's needed. Cheer, my comrades, cheer. Hold the fort, for we are coming. Union men, be strong. Side by side we battle onward. Victory is nigh. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale. That was great. Thank you just for all of everything today. It's just been, yeah, just so wonderful. Thanks. So we got our next presenter, Ken Cruz with American Postal Workers Union Local 338 here. And I just want to give a big thanks to Ken here, who's been an integral in getting kind of these efforts up to speed with, like, getting, this whole project to trying to get, Spokane to popularize this labor history here. So I will hand it over to Ken Cruz.
Thank you, Will. I want to start out, I'm going to give you a little update on the Postal Service right now, but in order to find out what's happening now, I want to give you a little background for everybody who may not be aware of it. Prior to 1970, the postal workers and the unions they had weren't unions that we see today. They were basically lobbying organizations. They would lobby Congress for wages because, of course, at that time, the Postal Service received all their money from Congress. They received tax money. And so things got so bad that in 1970, the Great Postal Strike occurred. And so the result of the Great Postal Strike, where it didn't happen all over the country, but big cities like New York and Chicago and other places where there were huge hubs that could really stall the mail. And so the result of that brought living wages to all postal workers. And for that, they gave up, the Postal Service gave up a cabinet level position in the executive branch, along with the tax money that would come with that. So now the Postal Service is self-funding. We rely solely on the goods and services we sell to the American public. So If anyone tries to tell you your tax money is going to the Postal Service, it's a big lie. And the reason why I bring that up is because a lot of what's happening now dates back to that. You may not be aware of this, but the Postal Service is the only federal union that can negotiate wages. All the other federal agencies cannot negotiate wages. Why? Because they receive tax money. We're the only ones, we generate our own income, so we actually are the one union that can do that. All the other unions negotiate working conditions and things of that nature, but they cannot negotiate for their wages. So now let's move on forward here. Ever since the Great Postal Strike in 1970, there have been private companies that have looked at the Postal Service and said, gosh, they're getting to be more of a competition for us, especially in the package industry. So there have been attempts in the past to try to privatize the post office. And the most strident and I guess you would say successful cause happened in 2006 when they passed the Postal Reform Act, Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act of 2006. And the lead up to that was the previous 3 years, the Postal Service had actually made money. So they took in more money than the expenses that they used for delivering mail to the American public. And so a lot of big companies were saying, well, if there could be money to be made on an organization like the Postal Service, a government agency, it should be privatized and we should be able to reap that profit. Basically, that's their philosophy. So keep that in mind, because that doesn't go away. That's always going to be there with some private industries that look at a public agency and say, if it can be made profitable, then we want it. We don't want it to be a public service. So now we come back up to this time right here. And since 2006 to now, the Postal Service has had their money drained through the 75-year pre-funding mandate for retiree healthcare. So it doesn't even cover that 75-year pre-funding was a total sham to starve the Postal Service of money they could use to modernize the post office. You know, if you have a car, at some point you're going to replace that car or do some repairs to it to keep it on the road and make it more efficient. Your house, you might weatherize and things like that. But the Postal Service was denied all that money because all that money was sucked away to give to this 75-year pre-funding mandate of employee or of retiree healthcare. And I say that again, healthcare, because people say retiree benefits. It's separate from the pension plan that the postal employees have. So this is strictly for retiree healthcare. And so billions of dollars went into this account. And in 2012, the Postal Service could no longer pay it. And so it became a debt. And so when you would see on an annual basis, the Postal Service is losing money, that's where they were losing money. That 95% of that was them losing money. And now it's come to be like 90% of that. And the 10% is from the inefficiencies. We've gotten to the point where we have vehicles that have been on the road for 30 years. And if you go out and honest to God, if you go out and do a search of postal vehicle fires, they will be as prevalent as cat videos out there. They're just hundreds a year now. When I started tracking this several years ago, you could only find like 15 or 20, and now they're all over the country because these vehicles have been on the road way too long. We're starting to get new vehicles if they ever get the contracts in place and bring those new vehicles in. But again, that's just one example. We have infrastructure from our networks, our computer networks, to our equipment that we use that needs to be upgraded, and we haven't had the money to do that. So, you should give kudos to any postal employee you see, because we are using bandages and duct tape to keep things together, to keep things running for the American public. And keep in mind, the Postal Service operates at cost, so there is no profit built into it. So anybody who thinks that the Postal Service could do better being privatized would be looking at it, it totally, you would lose your service delivery to your house. You'd probably have to go to a big warehouse and get your mail out of a PO box. The prevalence of marketing mail over your personal mail and packages would take precedence. So there's not a lot of good coming out of it, and then prices would increase dramatically. So those are things that I want to make you aware of. But so now we're here in the current state of the Postal Service. We've had Mr. DeJoy, the Postmaster General, since last June. And since he's been in place, he has reduced first-class mail service from an average on-time rate of 89% down to 40%. And when he was called out about this a month and a half ago at the House Oversight Committee, he basically told them, well, we weren't meeting the standard anyway, so what does it matter? You know, so his plan, his 10-year plan, and you might have heard of it, Delivering for America is his 10-year plan. One of the tenets of that is to slow down first-class mail, basically putting it on trucks instead of airplanes. And so that if you're used to having your first-class mail delivered within 3 to 5 days, it could be 5 to 7 or 5 to 10 days, or whenever they decide to deliver it, because it's coming on trucks then, if his plan goes through. So and so it just doesn't make any sense that you would sit there and say, well, we couldn't get it to 100%, so let's go down to 40% and we'll just deliver it whenever it gets delivered. So and think about that. We just had a really crucial election last November, and the Postal Service was telling states, look, if you're going to be doing mail-in ballots, you have to give them so many days because we won't be able to deliver. Imagine if they take, because it's it becomes a first-class product when they mail the ballots. Imagine if they say your letter mail, it will be delivered when it's delivered. Now, how much confidence is someone going to have in mail-in voting if they don't know if their ballot's going to get there because it's going to be delivered when it's delivered? I mean, there's delays. I was watching the hearings, the House Oversight Committee. There was one of the members of the committee said that they mailed a flat letter, and it took like 22 days for it to get from less than a couple hundred miles away. And so the delays are happening out there, and they're just increasing. There are several sites in the Facebook that I follow that people put out there, things that are happening in their local locations. More and more postal workers are working more overtime. You know, their days calling out on their days off to have them come in and work because they don't have enough workers. You know, and part of that is what the post office has been doing for years. They have a regular workforce and they have a temporary workforce. For my union, and there are 4 unions in the Postal Service now. In my union, they're called PSCs, Postal Support Employees. And so when they're brought in, they're paid a lower wage than we are. Their health benefits are limited, and they can be used any way that the Postal Service desires to use them. So that their working conditions are different than ours. And just to give you a little brief example of that, at my plant where I work at here in Spokane, I was talking to one of the people out on the floor because I work in the bulk mail section now, which is off to the side. And so I was in there talking to one of the guys that I worked with, and he said that things are bad right now because they've lost all their PSCs because they quit. They just resigned. And it's because the Postal Service is working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, and with no end in sight. And some of them are 7 days a week. And so, you know, you can't expect anybody to continue to work under those conditions without any relief in sight. If you were to say, you know, for the next couple of weeks, I need to have you come in, but when you say this is your schedule and that's it, if you don't like it, leave. Well, now they're losing the postal and support employees. Nobody's going to want to work for, and it's you know, for what they're getting paid. People have lives. I've seen something on Facebook that says, work is not your life. Work is how you fund your life. So your life is not the Postal Service. Your life is not your job. You should be able to have a life outside of work. So, you know, and people realize that after so much time of that kind of stuff going on, and so mail is being slowed down right now, and it's going to continue to slow down until something happens. Well, we have some relief in place that's happening. President Biden has nominated 3 new, how would you say, postal board of governors. They just passed the Senate subcommittee, and they're going to be going to the full Senate to be voted on. So this is something everyone can do. You can call your senators, and if you have relatives in other states, it's critical that you call them, especially in Republican states, and have them call their senators, because by and large, the majority of Democrats will be on board with supporting these people, and there will be some Republicans in the rural areas, because the Postal Service in the rural areas, that are Republican-held areas, and by and large, those senators will listen to their people, because it's a critical part of their everyday life is to make sure that they're getting their mail service. So when this comes up to a full vote here, probably in the next couple of weeks to a month, I would encourage everyone to call your senators. And again, if you have relatives that live in other states, call them and encourage them to call their senators. And the reason why I say that is because there was last fall, we were making calls to members of Congress and the Senate about what was happening back then about delaying the mail. And so because I don't live in Kentucky, I called McConnell's office, Mitch McConnell's office. And so apparently when you're out of state and you don't have the local area code, it goes right to a voicemail saying, we thank you for your call. We'd like to take your call. And it's please leave a message after the voicemail. And then it says the voicemail's full. So they do that on purpose so they don't have to hear anything from you if you're outside the area. But so it's critical that if you have relatives that live in those Republican states, friends, contact them, email them, let them know they need to contact them and ask them to call their senators to support these nominees. Now, I know there's been some people that have speculated saying that President Biden should have fired all the board of governors, and he would have been rightfully sold to do that because of everything they've done to slow down the mail. But the problem with that is if he does it now, he sets precedents, and so that if a Republican administration comes in the future, they could revert it back the other way. And so it's better to go this way. We've got next year, there's at least one of the Republicans will be terming out for the board of governors, and we should be able to get one of those positions. And the reason why I say that is because with these three nominees, once they're in place, we'll have 5 Democrats, but the 2 Democrats that are in there now have supported a lot of things that DeJoy has said. So it's not 100% hopeful that they would support a public post office going forward and making sure that first class mail and medications are delivered on time, that people can rely on the Postal Service instead of wondering, is it going to get there? Is it not going to get there? Is it going to get there in the next month or next week? You know, you have to have standards. And so, and I think the only way to do that is that Mr. DeJoy is removed and someone else is brought in that thinks of the Postal Service as a public service and not as a private enterprise. Because when you start talking, the Postal Service is not making a profit. It should never make a profit. It is a public service. It should cover its costs. No one looks at the military. No one looks at the Department of Labor. No one looks at the Department of Health and say they should be making a profit. Well, we're a government agency just like every other government agency, every other federal agency. It's just that we are not receiving taxpayer money. We have to rely on our own goods and services that we sell to fund our operations. And so that people need to take that to heart when they're talking about the Postal Service. And so let's see. Let me mention some other things that are going on right now. I mentioned that the slowdown of the first class mail. That's one of Mr. DeJoy's tenets of his 10-year Delivering for America plan. He wants to put all the first class mail on trucks instead of flying it when it needs to be flown there so it can get there in a certain amount of days. That's a bad thing. I'm not going to say everything's bad in the plan he has in place. He realizes that having a PSC crew as opposed to regular full-time employees is bad because the part of the reason why they're quitting is because they don't know when they'll be converted to regular, and they can't keep on going 6 days a week. The regulars are not doing that because they can't force them to do that. So one of his plans in that 10-year plan is to convert temporary employees, PSCs, to full-time employees. So when someone gets hired, they're immediately a full-time employee, which is a good thing. We've been fighting for that for years. But I think the only reason why he threw something like that in there is because he realized that right now in this time that they're having trouble getting people to work as a PSC, to get hired on as a PSC. So there are a lot of issues going on right now, but a starter would be to make sure that we get the 3 Biden nominees onto the Board of Governors. The second is to the House Oversight Committee that Mr. DeJoy testified to twice. They're working on legislation for sustaining the post office into the future. So we need to make sure that you're calling your members of the representatives, and again, contacting your friends and relatives in other states and having them contacting their representatives in those states and asking them that the post office must remain above anything else a public service. It cannot be privatized. It must be a public service, because if it were to be privatized, you would have less service, the prices would go up, And it would be more difficult for someone who is not making a living wage to use the Postal Service. And if you don't agree with me, then go out there and look. A first-class letter with the Postal Service is 55 cents to deliver anywhere in the country. You take that first-class letter to UPS or FedEx, and you're paying at least $8 to have that delivered. So, you know, there's and part of that's because those companies have to answer to stockholders. They have to answer to board of directors. You know, they're there to make a profit. The Postal Service is there to deliver the mail. And there's a reason why the Postal Service is handling all the last mile mail for all these companies, because they couldn't afford to do it themselves at the prices that they charge. They'd have to charge a lot more too. So keep that in mind, rural areas. And that's something that's been fought with the Postal Service since the early 1900s, delivering to rural areas letter mail for the same price that you deliver it in the city. And that's what's called the universal service obligation. So no matter where you are in the country, you can deliver a letter, you can mail a letter for 1 ounce letter for 55 cents, and it will get to wherever you're delivering it to. Some places we deliver them by mules in the Grand Canyon. Some places we deliver it by boat, Lake Ponderay. Other places in Alaska, they're delivered to the local villages on snowmobiles. So, you know, we deliver to everywhere, and that's why these other companies use us for their last mile, because they're not always going there. And if they're only delivering X amount of packages a day, they can bypass a lot of neighborhoods to deliver those packages. We go to every neighborhood 6 days a week, and on the 7th day, we're delivering Amazon packages. So with that, I think I will stop. Oh, the last thing I want to mention is the Public Post Office Day. Over the years, I've been hearing all this this talk about privatizing the post office, and so I got to thinking, the one thing I could do is change the narrative and have people start talking again about a public post office. And so in 2018, I petitioned the governor to issue a proclamation declaring it Public Post Office Day. And Public Post Office Day, I decided, should be November 27th, right after Thanksgiving and the start of the busy Christmas rush, because throughout the rest of the year, some people may not use the Postal Service, but during Christmas time, I guarantee you a lot of people use the Postal Service, and that would be the time to say, look at what we can provide for you. And so I'm pushing to make this like a national day of recognition. I know there's several other states through the unions in other states, through my union and the other local unions within my national union. I've gotten other states to issue proclamations, but I would like to have President Biden do that. So maybe in the future we can get that, so that where every year people celebrate November 27th as Public Post Office Day. And so when you have a Public Post Office Day, it's kind of hard to say, let's privatize the public post office. And that's my thought on that. So, and I'll be glad to answer any questions anybody has after we're ready to take them. So thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Ken. That was a very, very important subject with the USPS right now. I mean, it's a lifeline to just so many communities across the United States, regardless of where you live. So yeah, Dale, we got one more song. If you got one more song for us, Dale.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah.
This last song, again, is probably one you've heard before, maybe sung before, but Which Side Are You On? This song was written in 1931 by Florence Reese. This context is was a bitter strike in southeastern Kentucky, in the mining area, and Florence Reese's husband was a labor leader in this strike. And the owner of the mine, J.H. Blair, came looking for him with some of his hired thugs, we'll say, came into the house. Reese was gone, but it so terrorized his wife and children that she ended up writing lyrics that night that ended up being put to a Baptist hymn again. So this is Which Side Are You On? Come all of you good workers, good news to you I'll tell, of how the good old Union has come in here to dwell. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? My daddy was a miner, he's now in the air and sun, and I'll stick with the Union till every battle's won. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? They say in Harlan County there are no neutrals there. You're either with the Union or a thug with J.H. Blair. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Well, workers, can you stand it? Oh, tell me how you can. Will you be a crummy scab or lend a son? Lend us all a hand. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Don't scab for the bosses, don't listen to their lies. Us poor folks haven't got a chance unless we organize. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Thank you so much, Dale. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's
You're
a
welcome. Thank you.
great
Thanks for asking.
song. Yeah, there's a lot of good covers of that song throughout the years. I think Pete Seeger, Natalie Merchant, and a black metal group from Kentucky, Panopticon, covered that song. Yeah, this is such a great song. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so just want to, do a brief summary discussion of all the presenters, and then, we can go into kind of questions in the chat or in the Q&A. So yeah, we'll start out with our first presenter, Bob Lambeth, who gave us a presentation on the Spokane IWW and the free speech fights of 1909 and 1910. And how they're kind of, the way they went about things was through via means of anarcho-syndicalism, direct action, and kind of passive resistance. And this was around the times when, labor went to war with capital, and when the workers were speaking out against injustices, these like these job agencies that were just taking advantage of workers. The city council was, stacked against the workers, and established the law prohibiting a local ordinance prohibiting the workers soapboxing at street corners in downtown Spokane. And through passive resistance, city of Spokane was able to overturn that, and there was some other consequences about that, with the ACLU forming later on. And then we had Tina Morrison with the Regional Labor Council, spoke some lengths about some important pro-worker legislation called the Protect the Right to Organize Act, also known as the PRO Act, that actually just recently passed Congress. And I think Joe Biden recently said that he wants it on his desk so he could sign it. It's a pro-worker legislation that goes to, expand civil rights. And Tina spoke to some lengths about musicians in Spokane and their struggle to properly get paid for their work. And then we have Ken Cruz, who spoke about the struggles of the postal workers. How the pre-funding mandate in 2006. The PRO Act did pass the House, need to be approved by the Senate. Thank you, Tina. Yep. And there's the postal strike of 1970 and the pre-funding mandate of 2006, a 75-year pre-funding mandate that's kind of seeking to privatize or weaken the postal union, and then the USPS. And then we had Dale Soden, who sang us some labor songs. Thank you so much. Sang them interspersed, like Hold the Fort, Which Side Are You On, The Preacher and the Slave. And so with that being said, we'll open up some questions in the chat. And if we can for about 10 minutes, and then, we'll do our conclusions. And yeah, so opening up some questions here for the presenters. Feel free to put any questions you got. Okay, George. Okay, one moment, George. I'll put you live here. Let's see. Where are you? Oh, there you are. Okay. All right, George. You can feel free to speak and ask us any questions.
Yes, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you.
This is to all the panelists, and to thank them so much for spending some time this Saturday afternoon. On the question of the IWW and its history here in Spokane, there are still vestiges of the IWW here in Spokane. There is a local chapter that still meets monthly, and also there's a group called Direct Action, which takes that name, Direct Action, from the IWW movement in the early 1900s. That group, Direct Action, still exists. I'm a member of it. It's a small group whose purpose is to consider nonviolent disobedience when it's appropriate for and effective for causes. Our last action was to attempt to block a railroad train in 2017. That litigation is still in the courts 4 years later, and it will be coming back to district court in Spokane. So I just wanted to lift that up and ask the panelists, do you think that now that we have a labor secretary that is a former union leader, and we have a labor-friendly president, that things might move a little bit? That's the question.
I'd
Thank
be happy to jump in if you don't mind. And the answer is yes. Just briefly, when I was elected to be Secretary Treasurer of the Regional Labor Council, my first year, that's when the Friedrichs decision was coming before before the Supreme Court. So we were, pushing back against the Friedrichs decisions. Scalia dies. So then Trump gets elected. So then all of a sudden, OSHA things are not being filled. All of a sudden, the NLRB is getting completely, imbalanced, shall we say. And then, and then the Janus decision comes down, and the Janus decision, of course, is to weaken the private sector or public sector unions, so that you can be a union, you can get all of the benefits from a union, but not have to pay anything into the union, right? So all of this happened in my first 5 years in office, and then Biden gets elected. And all of a sudden, I see change. I see the labor movement waking up in ways I have never seen in my 30 years or more. I see activism, and I hear people speaking positively about unions, when for so much of my life, union was a dirty word. So yeah, there's change. It's awesome.
Well, I'd like to answer that question maybe more from a perspective of an historian. I mean, I want to get Dale's input on this too, if he could, if he doesn't mind. But I really would like to be positive and think and not be cynical about it. And I think Tony's right, or Tina, sorry. I think Tina's right that there's a resurgence, kind of a resurgence, but I think that there has to be the traditional kind of way that union organizers, unions, that rank and file are used to interacting with their union, how they're used to, the kind of the general rubric that has been used for union organizing, I think, it's something that unions have really stuck to for a long time and have refused to try and like modify. Not refused, but I think generally speaking, there needs to be a total reconfiguration of how Americans understand unions and how organizing should commence. Like, I don't know how or what it would be, but I just can't help like escape this feeling that the manner in which unions have been organizing is no longer viable. I mean, not that it doesn't work and doesn't garner results, but just that there's a different kind of struggle going on against unions. And it's the same one. I mean, it's the same fight that's been being fought for a long time, but the people that are doing the fighting on both sides change, the strategies change, the weapons change, right? So I don't know. I just seeing it from a historical perspective and watching this kind of steady decline, although a lot of it has been because of, I mean, this post-Taft-Hartley stuff that has been designed at the top, the national level, to weaken unions. If we remove that, are we still going to see success with the standard rubric that we're using now? I don't think so. I think that something needs to change, especially with the disappearing of manufacturing in this country. And a reliance on the service industry unions, I think, is really the biggest unions in the country, right? So I don't know. I'll stop babbling about that, but I'm just kind of curious what another historian might think about that kind of babbling I just did.
Yeah, no, thanks, Bob. And I'll offer some tentative observations and comments because it's not really an area that I feel all that confident, particularly in the current stage. But here are the couple of things are I don't know if they're worrisome. I think the Amazon situation needs to be unpacked. I think along the lines of what you're saying. I mean, why has that been so difficult? You would think that right now there's that's a group of workers that really could benefit from unionization, and yet there's obviously resistance to that. And I'm not sure whether or not they feel in general that their issues are now basically being advocated by governments, whether that's wage rates themselves or whether or not it's actual working conditions, health and safety issues. I'm not sure. But the other thing that's in the news is, of course, police unions and resistance to police reform. And I think it underscores your point to a certain extent, Bob. So I agree. I mean, on the face of it, I certainly agree with Tina that the Biden administration is, and Tina, you know this way better than I do, but it is a very pro-union, pro-worker administration on the face of it. But I think your point is a good one, Bob. That traditional means of organization or even traditional issues have to be re-examined. I don't know how Ken thinks about this. I mean, and but I'll stop with that.
Okay, so in my local, there's a lot of I would say apathy as far as getting involved with things because a lot of members look at the people who are elected for the office to take care of whatever needs to be done. So and I'll just give you an example. When I hold events for our postal days of organization, I always reach out to multiple groups. I don't count much on postal workers, and it's a shame to say it. Well, part of it's because they work different shifts, but the other part is just getting people fired up about participating in some of this because it's important. It's important that the public know. And I think part of the problem is there for a lot of people that are in today's generation, the younger people, they don't know a union. I remember growing up in Spokane. My dad was a union member, and when I went to school, I always noticed that the people whose parents worked and were union members had a better standard of living than others. You know, you could tell it, the kids that had clean clothes, clean serviceable clothes, as opposed to those that parents did not work in unions. And think back in the 70s, we had Kaiser, we had, you know, we had a lot more than what we have now. And so the union decline from the 70s is not only caused a decline in union members, but it's declined a knowledge of people growing up of what a union is. And so I think part of the challenge is to educate people that a union is, you know, is important. If you work in a location and you want to make sure that you have decent working conditions, and some of these things, if they've worked at places like Walmart and things like that, you have to sit there and say, okay, so just think about it. You work at Walmart, and at any time they could say, you know, you're fired. If you're in a union shop, 99% of union shops have progressive discipline. So you can't just fire someone. You have to go through progressive discipline to fire someone. And that's very basic for someone. I mean, you point those things out to people, and that's how you change their attitude towards unions. I mean, because growing up, I mean, think about it. The movies that we had to watch were Hoffa, you know, and things like that, that unions were bad. I mean, there's been, that's why I came up with Public Post Office Day, because there's been so much on the other side that the messaging that they put out, that people sit there and that's what they absorb, and so that's what they think, and that's what they repeat. So the messaging from union members and supporters of unions needs to be heard loud and clear by everyone, that unions are not a bad thing. Unions are there for improving your working conditions, allowing you to have a say in your job, and in making sure you have a decent wage. And so, you know, I think that's probably our biggest struggle today is not only with inside our unions, but the younger people today, convincing them that a union is, and teaching them what a union is. I mean, it's hard for someone who's never been in a union. I mean, once they join a union and they say, okay, well, you have this, you mean I don't need to do that? No, you're going by a contract, and that's what they have to follow, is the contract that we negotiated with them. So that's what they have to do. So with that, I'll just leave it there. So.
Can I add just a couple of things? One, you know, a lot of this is about education of the general public. I mean, if we look at California AB 5, you know, and how it you know, dealt with misclassification of you know, gig workers, and the pushback in particular from, you know, people like musicians on that they didn't want to be employees. A lot of that is just based on misinformation, and we have a big job just to educate people about what those classifications mean. Just briefly on police reform, you know, when we bring in, you know, police unions, you know, the thing that we have to understand about police unions is they are elected by their members. They don't hire their members. The city, the government hires their members, and the members elect them to represent them. So, you know, that's to me, you know, part of the issue, where like our city council has a lot of control over, you know, putting together the hiring process for police officers, and that could really change, you know, the projection, or I can't find the word, where the police union ends up. If they've got, you know, their applications, you know, in such a way that they're screening out people that are not racist and are not, you know, warlike, then that's going to change the whole tenor of that police union. It's hard to do it from the union down. It's easier to do it from the outside in that case, in my opinion. And then the other thing I just want to mention is, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, look up the Lewis Powell Memo of 1971, which was a strategic plan to basically undermine unions. And it's a very interesting document, and the other thing, to understand about unions is many of us are, we're just working people. I'm a bassoonist. I have absolutely no background in labor. Going to Coeur d'Alene High School, they sure didn't talk about unions there, right? So, and as we learn things and as we go through the labor movement, we pick up little bits and pieces. For example, I don't know if this is true or not, Bob, but a former president of the musicians union in Missoula told me that it was formed by the Buffalo soldiers that were stationed there. So just a little snippet. You never know what the actual facts are, but he seemed to be pretty confident with that one. But we're really busy as labor leaders and all of the pieces of labor in a local union, the executive boards, the committee people, just trying to push back in every single way that we can. But it is a matter of having to completely re-educate our members, re-educate the American public. In the meantime, paying attention to our local politicians, and that includes the Democrats, who are not always labor friendly. And I think of the Clinton administration and how that really had such a huge negative impact on workers in the United States through NAFTA, et cetera. So it's a big challenge, but as workers, if we all think about each other and all care about each other, and everybody, here is a worker at some level, if the rules aren't rigged against us, we have the opportunity of changing things for the better for working people.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I'm long-winded.
Just really quick, I just want to throw something in here. You mentioned gig workers, being a musician, you did a lot of that and it's in your blood. I mean, that's another thing too. I think taking a page from the IWW of 1909 and looking at this gig economy and this employer focus on temp services. Right. I think that these two, gig work and temp work, are two huge roadblocks, aside from all the legal and political, stuff we have to maneuver around and over. I think figuring out a way in which to bring to light the general public, to bring to their, view, the kind of economic problems that occur when we allow employers to focus on gig workers running our economy and temp workers, right? Because there are no unions in these, kind of in gig work, but definitely not in temp services. So anyway, yeah, I think that if we look at successful campaigns of direct action, such as what the IWW did with free speech fights in 1909, maybe we can find something in there of finding a kind of a common enemy in which to focus on in a way that sheds a positive light on union work, right? Like in the general public, people that aren't familiar with unions or understand what they're doing, right? So anyway, I just think gig work and temp services, I think, is something that should be on union leadership radar a little bit more, if it isn't already.
Thank you for that, Bob, and thanks again, Tina. That was a great question. Thanks to all the panelists who answered that. So we're approaching the 5 o'clock hour. I'm thinking we can probably have time for one more question and kind of one more small round of discussion before we start to wrap up here. Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to type it in the chat, raise your hand, or just any means and methods to answer. Let's see. Okay. As nobody's raised their hand. Okay. So I'm gonna say that, we're gonna go into kind of the conclusion of everything of this event. I just want to have a big thank you to all the panelists for taking time to come out and celebrate May Day, especially, during this pandemic. We have a world to win. And I want to just thank all of the community members helped put this together. The Dorothy Day Labor Forum, Nick and Linda, and everybody involved with that. Thank you so much. Thanks to the educators. Thanks to Larry Sebula from Eastern Washington University for connecting me with so many of this wonderful panelists. And thank you, Ken. Thank you to the newly formed branch of the Spokane Industrial Workers of the World. They're back. They're co-sponsor of this event and have been putting some work to help popularize Spokane's labor history. And of course, thank you to some of the folks at the Spokane Democratic Socialists of America. And so I just want to plug kind of just the free speech effort link one more time, and put it in the chat here. Let's see, free speech, spread it around to your friends and comrades. pjaws.org/free speech. And thank you, Larry. And I will I will upload this event to YouTube so folks can kind of look at it in case they missed it. And big thank you to everybody, and solidarity forever. All right, everybody, enjoy your weekend. Take care.
Thanks again, Will.
Thank you.